The desk in the observation bunker overlooked the French coastline where the Pas-de-Calais met the English Channel, and on that morning in the final days of August 1944, the technical officers stationed at the German anti-aircraft installation couldn't make sense of what their calculations were telling them. They had run the numbers 3 times already, each officer checking the other's work, because what they were seeing in the morning intelligence summary defied every textbook they had studied during their training with the Luftwaffe's technical corps. 82% of the flying bombs were being eliminated before reaching their targets. Someone suggested the figure must be wrong, that perhaps a decimal point had been misplaced or that the observation crews along the coast had made errors in their counting, but the reports kept coming in with the same impossible statistics. Through the powerful optical instruments mounted in their concrete emplacements, German spotters had been tracking the missiles since before dawn, watching the pulse jet engines carry them across the Channel toward England, and what they witnessed contradicted everything their intelligence analysts had assured them about British defensive capabilities. The missiles were being destroyed at rates that shouldn't have been possible according to the laws of ballistics and probability theory. These weren't fighter aircraft chasing down the bombs and risking their own destruction in the resulting explosions, nor were they weapons becoming entangled in the steel cables of barrage balloons deployed across the approaches to London. Instead, the destruction was happening over the coastal defensive zone where British anti-aircraft batteries were positioned, and the shells were somehow finding their targets with a precision that German physics said couldn't exist. The commander of the entire offensive operation, an officer named Max Wachtel, who held the rank of Oberst and ran Flak Regiment 155W from his headquarters in an old chateau, received these field reports with increasing concern. His staff had been tracking the progression over the summer months, and the trend was unmistakable and deeply troubling. When the campaign had begun back in June, British defences were destroying roughly 17% of the missiles. By the time August arrived, that figure had climbed to 74%, and now they were seeing days where more than 8 out of every 10 missiles launched were being eliminated before impact. This represented the beginning of what would become one of the most significant technological surprises experienced by German weapon development programs throughout the entire conflict. What neither Wachtel nor any scientist working for the Reich's military research establishment understood was that they were witnessing the operational deployment of one of the war's most jealously guarded technological secrets, a development that received security classification at the same level reserved for the American atomic weapon program. The British and Americans called it the proximity fuse, though for security purposes it was designated VT, which officially stood for variable time, a deliberately misleading label designed to confuse enemy intelligence. This device was systematically dismantling the Führer's terror weapon campaign with an effectiveness that German technical understanding suggested should have been impossible to achieve. The chain of events had started 10 weeks before that August morning, on the 13th of June, exactly 7 days after Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy. In retaliation for the invasion, the German leadership had finally unleashed the long-promised revenge weapon against the British capital. At 4 in the morning on that June day, the first of these weapons struck London in an area called Grove Road in the Bow District, demolishing a railway bridge and surrounding residences. The attack killed 6 civilians, wounded 30 more, and left 200 people without homes. The weapon represented the culmination of years of German engineering effort, a pilotless flying machine driven by an Argus pulse jet engine carrying nearly a ton of high explosive at speeds exceeding 600 kilometers per hour. It was humanity's first operational cruise missile, and the German High Command believed this technology would force Britain to sue for peace. Walter Dornberger, a major who directed the revenge weapons program at the Peenemünde Research Facility, had calculated that even assuming a conservative success rate of just 1 in 4 missiles reaching their targets, the flying bomb would deliver more destructive power to London than the entire Blitz campaign that had terrorized the city from 1940 through 1941. Each missile cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture, which represented a tiny fraction of what it cost to mount a manned bombing raid, and unlike conventional bombing, there was zero risk to trained aircrew, who were becoming increasingly scarce as the war dragged on. The scientists and engineers at the Peenemünde Army Research Centre had legitimate reasons for confidence in their creation. They had pioneered advanced rocket technology that would eventually carry humanity into space. They had developed operational jet-powered aircraft that outperformed anything the Allies possessed, and now they had fielded the world's first cruise missile. Robert Lucer, the engineer who had designed the weapon's sophisticated control system, ran calculations showing that Allied interception should be nearly impossible to achieve. The flying bomb travelled at 640 km per hour, while varying its altitude anywhere between 600 and 2,700 metres above the ground. British fighter aircraft needed to achieve speeds exceeding 650 km per hour just to catch up with the missile, and then they had to close to within 200 metres to destroy it, which meant risking their own destruction in the massive explosion that would follow. As for anti-aircraft fire, the mathematical probability of scoring a direct hit on such a small, fast-moving target came out to less than 1 shell in 10,000 actually connecting with the missile. This wasn't propaganda designed to boost morale, but solid ballistic science based on proven principles. Conventional artillery shells, fitted with timed fuses, required gunners to accurately predict where the target would be when the shell reached it, perform precise calculations under time pressure, manually set the fuse mechanism, and hope that everything timed out perfectly. When dealing with a target moving at the speed of these missiles, gun crews had perhaps 30 seconds from the moment of detection until the weapon passed beyond their engagement range. Wachtel himself, who commanded the Flying Bomb Regiment, understood these limitations from both sides of the anti-aircraft warfare equation, having served in defensive roles earlier in the war. Over the course of the campaign, German forces would launch 9,521 of these missiles from ground installations targeting England, and an additional thousands more from aircraft, confident that British defences couldn't possibly stop enough of them to prevent devastating damage to civilian morale and industrial capacity. Within days of the first launches, disturbing intelligence reports began reaching German analysis centres. British anti-aircraft defences were adapting to the threat with suspicious rapidity. By late June, the interception rate had climbed from 10% to 24%, which was higher than predicted but still explainable through improved tactics and crew training. Then July arrived, and the statistics became genuinely inexplicable. German technical officers monitoring the campaign's effectiveness noticed that British gun batteries were claiming kills while expending impossibly small quantities of ammunition. Observers stationed along the French coast reported watching missiles fly steadily toward England, only to suddenly become surrounded by anti-aircraft bursts and then tumble from the sky, despite the explosions appearing to occur too far away from the missiles to cause damage through direct hits or shrapnel. What German intelligence services didn't know was that they were witnessing proximity fuses that converted near misses into effective kills. The technology had actually been operational in the Pacific Theatre since January of 1943, when the USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber using shells that detonated automatically when they sensed proximity to their target. The German intelligence failure was comprehensive and total. There had been hints available, including a mysterious document called the Oslo Report that had surfaced in November of 1939, mentioning proximity fuse research, but German scientists had dismissed the entire report as Allied disinformation designed to waste their research resources. Germany had attempted to develop similar technology, with more than 30 different design approaches researched at various facilities, but none had achieved operational status or even looked particularly promising. German engineers had actually concluded that proximity fuses were fundamentally impossible to create with existing technology. The technical challenges appeared insurmountable when examined systematically. You needed to miniaturize radio transmitter and receiver components to fit inside an artillery shell. You had to create vacuum tubes capable of surviving the 20,000 G forces experienced during gunfiring. You required batteries that could remain dormant for years in storage, yet activate instantly when needed. And then you needed to achieve mass production of all these components at costs that made military sense. Yet by August of 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 of these devices daily, a production rate that would have seemed like fantasy to German industrial planners. During that final week of August in 1944, the proximity fuse achieved its maximum effectiveness against the flying bomb threat. The British had completely reorganized their entire anti-aircraft defense system specifically to counter this weapon. Gun batteries employed American-made SCR-584 radar systems that automatically tracked incoming targets and calculated firing solutions without human intervention. More critically, they were firing shells equipped with these VT fuses that had been specifically modified to address the unique challenges posed by the small, fast-moving missiles. The Royal Artillery and RAF regiment units had been redeployed from their positions in the North Downs area down to the south coast, creating a concentrated belt of anti-aircraft firepower. This coastal positioning ensured that any shells that failed to detonate would fall harmlessly into the sea, rather than landing on British soil, where German forces might recover them and discover the secret. As the missiles crossed the English coastline, they entered a killing zone where technology had completely trumped traditional statistics and probability. The radar systems automatically locked onto each target as it appeared, calculated its trajectory and speed, and fed precise firing solutions to the gun crews. The proximity fuses themselves contained miniature radio transmitters that had been developed by companies like Sylvania Electric and Western Electric, using vacuum tubes specially hardened to survive the brutal forces of gunfiring. When the radio signals reflected back indicated that the shell was near a large metallic object, electronic switches called thyratrons triggered the detonators, sending steel fragments tearing through the missile's thin aluminum skin and vital components. On that peak day in late August, coastal gun batteries destroyed 82% of incoming missiles, a rate that German engineers had calculated was physically impossible to achieve, even in theory. Reports of this 82% interception rate created emergency meetings at German headquarters across occupied France. Wachtel suspected that perhaps saboteurs had infiltrated the manufacturing facilities and were deliberately damaging missiles before launch. Emergency inspections were ordered and conducted thoroughly, but nothing wrong was found with the weapons themselves. Test firings over German-controlled territory showed completely normal performance across all parameters. The problem only manifested when missiles flew against British defences, which ruled out manufacturing defects or sabotage. German technical experts concluded that the British must have developed revolutionary anti-aircraft systems, but they couldn't determine the specifics without capturing actual examples of the technology for analysis. They tried varying their tactics in every way they could imagine. They launched missiles at different altitudes, they fired larger salvos simultaneously to overwhelm defences, they concentrated on night launches to reduce visibility, they tried to exploit weather conditions. Nothing worked. The kill rate remained devastatingly high regardless of what adjustments they made. At the Peenemünde research facility, scientists were forced to confront an uncomfortable conclusion that challenged their fundamental assumptions. If the Allies had actually developed working proximity fuses, then they had achieved something that Germany's best minds had determined was impossible with current technology. German efforts to uncover the secret intensified throughout the summer, but they failed completely at every level. The proximity fuse's security arrangements were nearly perfect. Production was compartmentalized across 110 separate factories throughout the United States. Workers at each facility knew only their specific tasks and had no knowledge of how their components fit into the larger system. Even the designation variable time was deliberately misleading, suggesting conventional timed fuses rather than proximity sensing devices. By mid-1944, a substantial portion of the American electronics industry's productive capacity was devoted to manufacturing these fuses. 22 million proximity fuses would be produced before the war ended, at a total cost exceeding $1 billion in 1940s currency values. The Crossley Corporation alone manufactured over 5 million fuses, representing nearly a quarter of total American production. The numbers revealed a staggering industrial mismatch between the two sides. While Germany struggled to produce flying bombs using forced labor under deteriorating conditions, America had transformed its entire electronics industry to manufacture fuses at unprecedented scales. Peak daily production reached 40,000 individual units. Manufacturing costs dropped from $732 per unit in 1942 to just $18 by 1945 through improved production methods and economies of scale. Crossley Corporation, which had manufactured radios and refrigerators before the war, employed 10,000 workers who were producing 16,000 fuses daily at peak output. Sylvania Electric dedicated its entire vacuum tube research division to developing ruggedized components capable of surviving gunfiring, eventually producing 400,000 miniaturized tubes daily, with 95% of all tubes used in proximity fuses coming from their facilities. The contrast was absolute and fundamental. Germany handcrafted advanced weapons in limited numbers using increasingly scarce resources and forced labor working under terrible conditions. America mass-produced revolutionary technology at scales that German planners couldn't even conceptualize. Monthly American proximity fuse production exceeded the total number of flying bombs Germany would produce during the entire war. The proximity fuse represented extraordinary engineering achievement at every level. The device had to survive being fired from a gun, which meant withstanding 20,000 G acceleration forces, spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute, and operating across extreme temperature ranges. Sylvania engineers developed miniature vacuum tubes based on hearing aid designs, but reinforced them to survive forces that would pulverize normal electronic components. The batteries had to remain dormant for years of storage, yet activate instantly when needed, and then function reliably under combat conditions. The fuse contained a miniature radio system that transmitted signals continuously once activated. When the reflected signals indicated proximity to a large metallic object, electronic circuits triggered the detonation mechanism. This seemingly simple concept required solving problems that German engineers had concluded were fundamentally impossible with available technology and materials. Quality control procedures were unprecedented in their rigor. Every single fuse underwent multiple testing procedures. Random samples from production batches were actually fired in test guns to verify they would survive combat conditions. Rejection rates remained below 2%, which demonstrated remarkable manufacturing precision achieved at massive industrial scale. By September of 1944, the flying bomb offensive had been effectively neutralized as a strategic threat. Of the 9,521 missiles launched from ground installations against Britain, only 2,515 actually reached London, where they killed 6,184 civilians and injured 17,981 more. While these casualties were certainly tragic and represented real human suffering, the numbers were a small fraction of what German planners had intended to inflict. General Frederick Pyle, who commanded Britain's anti-aircraft command, calculated that without proximity fuses, flying bomb casualties would have been 4 to 5 times higher than they actually were. The proximity fuse had quite literally saved London from the devastation that German leadership had planned to inflict. Germany shifted tactics to night launches and accelerated development of the V-2 rocket, which travelled too fast for any existing defence system to intercept. But these desperate measures couldn't achieve the strategic impact that leadership had promised. The flying bomb program became an expensive failure that consumed resources desperately needed on the collapsing eastern and western fronts. The German failure to detect the existence of proximity fuses represented one of history's greatest intelligence disasters. Despite extensive spy networks and considerable technical expertise within the intelligence services, German analysts never grasped what technology they were facing. The program remained completely secret throughout the war's duration. Not a single intact proximity fuse fell into German hands during the entire flying bomb campaign, despite thousands of shells being fired. Remarkably, during the Battle of the Bulge offensive in December of 1944, German forces overran an American ammunition dump that contained proximity-fused artillery shells, but they never recognized what they had captured. Their fundamental assumption that such devices were impossible had effectively blinded them to physical evidence sitting in their own hands. After Germany's surrender in May of 1945, interrogations of military personnel revealed complete German ignorance about proximity fuses and their capabilities. Oberst Max Wachtel told Allied intelligence officers that his staff had suspected the British might have developed improved radar systems or perhaps faster methods of setting conventional time fuses, but they had never imagined self-detonating shells that could sense their own proximity to targets. German scientists who were shown captured American proximity fuses expressed genuine disbelief at what they were seeing. They couldn't comprehend how vacuum tubes could survive the acceleration forces of gun firing, how batteries could remain viable through years of storage, or how electronic circuits could continue functioning after experiencing 20,000 G-forces. Several engineers estimated that German technology was at least 10 years behind what America had achieved in this field. Merle Tuve, who led the proximity fuse development effort at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, later reflected that their success came from systematic collaboration between scientists, engineers, and production workers, something that totalitarian systems with their rigid hierarchies and suspicion-filled atmospheres simply couldn't replicate or achieve. The proximity fuse demonstrated conclusively that the war's outcome was being determined in laboratories and factories just as much as on battlefields. While Germany pursued exotic wonder weapons that promised dramatic results, America focused on multiplicative technologies that enhanced the effectiveness of existing weapon systems. The proximity fuse made every anti-aircraft gun 5 to 10 times more effective than it had been previously, which represented a force multiplication that exceeded adding entirely new gun batteries. James Forrestal, who served as Secretary of the Navy, stated publicly that the proximity fuse had helped blaze the trail to Japan, and that without the protection this ingenious device had given the surface ships of the fleet, the westward advance across the Pacific could not have proceeded so swiftly, and the cost measured in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater than what was actually experienced. The flying bomb program relied heavily on slave labor drawn from concentration camps, with tens of thousands of prisoners dying in the underground factories where missiles were manufactured under brutal conditions. Meanwhile, American workers voluntarily worked overtime shifts for premium wages, most of them not knowing exactly what they were producing but understanding that it was important for the war effort. At Sylvania's facility in Ipswich, Massachusetts, over 5,000 women worked 12-hour shifts producing specialized components for the fuses. They discovered only after the war ended that their work had helped save London from the terror weapons that German leadership had threatened to unleash. The proximity fuse secret was maintained with absolute discipline. British anti-aircraft crews firing the special ammunition didn't know what made their shells so much more effective than conventional rounds. They simply knew they had special ammunition that came with strict accounting requirements and security procedures. Every proximity-fused shell fired at incoming missiles was carefully tracked and documented. Any unexploded shells that fell on land were immediately secured by special recovery teams. Naval vessels patrolled the English Channel to prevent German forces from recovering any shells that might fall into the water and sink in shallow areas where they could be retrieved. This obsessive secrecy actually cost lives in other theatres. Allied ground forces couldn't be permitted to use proximity-fused artillery shells until December of 1944 because the risk of German forces capturing intact examples was too great. Thousands of Allied soldiers died fighting across France and into Germany during battles where proximity-fused artillery could have saved their lives, but the technology remained too secret to risk exposing it to potential enemy capture. Yet using the fuses against flying bombs was deemed justified because London's survival during the critical period of the invasion was absolutely crucial to Allied strategy, and the coastal gun positioning ensured German forces couldn't recover any duds for analysis. For Germany, the entire flying bomb program drained critical resources while achieving minimal strategic impact relative to the investment required. Launching approximately 25,000 missiles in total cost millions of Reichsmarks and diverted industrial capacity and skilled labour from producing fighter aircraft and anti-tank weapons that were desperately needed on the shrinking fronts in both East and West. The programme's reliance on slave labour added a moral dimension to its failure that became fully apparent only after the war ended. The proximity fuse was defeating weapons that had been built through systematic human suffering, a contrast that participants understood only when the full scope of the camp system became public knowledge. The proximity fuse represented warfare's fundamental transformation from contests of individual weapon superiority to victory through engineering excellence and industrial production capacity. It proved that modern warfare had become a contest of industrial systems rather than simply military forces facing each other across a battlefield. Before saving the Pacific Fleet's ships from Japanese kamikaze attacks and enabling the rapid advance toward Japan's home islands, the proximity fuse saved London from the terror weapon campaign. The Germans, watching their missiles fall from the sky, never understood why their calculations had proven so wildly incorrect. The technology that was defeating them remained inconceivable within their scientific and industrial framework. The transformation in defensive effectiveness was genuinely dramatic. Before proximity fuses were deployed, destroying a single flying bomb required firing an average of 2,500 heavy anti-aircraft shells, which represented an enormous expenditure of ammunition, barrel wear, and crew fatigue. With proximity fuses deployed, the gunbelt's interception rate rose from 17% in June to 82% by late August, an increase achieved in just 10 weeks of continuous operations. This dramatic improvement wasn't accomplished through superior courage or better crew training, though both certainly helped, but rather through the mass production of advanced technology on a scale that Germany couldn't match or even comprehend as being possible. America had mobilized its entire electronics industry for this effort, employing over 80,000 workers across more than 100 factories, and invested over $1 billion to produce 22 million individual fuses by the time production finally ended after Japan's surrender. The proximity fuse technology was finally declassified in September of 1945, after both Germany and Japan had surrendered, and there was no longer any enemy who might benefit from learning the secret. The War Department's public announcement began by stating that this was one of the most important weapons developed during the entire war, surpassed in overall effectiveness only by the atomic bomb itself. For German scientists who had spent months puzzling over the flying bomb failures and trying to understand what had gone wrong with their calculations, the revelation brought both understanding and a certain humiliation. They had been defeated not primarily by superior strategy or exceptional courage from their enemies, though both played their roles, but by industrial capacity operating at scales they hadn't imagined were possible to achieve. Post-war interviews with captured German technical personnel revealed genuine shock at what they learned. They had believed that their flying bomb represented the absolute pinnacle of weapons technology available to any nation. Learning that it had been systematically defeated by mass-produced electronics costing less than $20 each by the war's end was devastating to their professional pride. They had lost not to superior warriors, but to superior assembly lines and industrial organization. The proximity fuse technology evolved after the war into modern air defense systems, radar altimeters that enable safe aircraft landing in poor weather conditions, visibility, and numerous electronic warfare capabilities that remain classified even today. For Germany's former weapons scientists, many of whom went to work for American or Soviet programs after the war, it remained a permanent reminder of their wartime blindness to what their enemies were capable of achieving. The proximity fuse proved definitively that in modern industrial warfare, the ability to mass-produce good enough technology matters far more than crafting perfect weapons in small numbers. Germany produced brilliant individual weapons that represented genuine engineering achievements. America produced effective weapons by the millions using industrial methods that prioritized reliability and production volume over theoretical perfection. On that remarkable day in late August of 1944, when proximity fuses destroyed 82% of the flying bombs launched against Britain, the fundamental nature of warfare changed forever, though most participants didn't recognize it at the time. The Germans launching their revenge weapons from sites along the French coast never knew what invisible technology was systematically defeating their missiles. They had done everything right according to their understanding of warfare and technology. They had developed advanced weapons using cutting-edge science. They had trained elite technical crews to operate launch sites. They had achieved genuine technological breakthroughs that would influence post-war development. Yet they were being comprehensively defeated by mass-produced electronics they couldn't even imagine existed. The proximity fuse saved London through thousands upon thousands of small explosions, each one guided by technology that German science had determined was fundamentally impossible to create. It was industrial warfare in its purest form, victory through superior organization and production capacity, rather than superior individual courage or tactical brilliance. But it mattered just as much as any battlefield heroics. In the final analysis, America's greatest victory wasn't achieved on battlefields through dramatic confrontations, but rather in factories where millions of workers, many of them women who didn't know what they were actually making or how it would be used, produced the tiny electronic devices that saved a city and transformed warfare forever. The 82% interception rate achieved during that week in late August of 1944 stood as mathematical proof that in modern industrial warfare, sufficient production capacity and industrial organization could defeat any wonder weapon, no matter how ingenious its design or how much theoretical promise it held. The proximity fuse was more than just another weapon added to the arsenal. It was living evidence that democracy's ability to mobilize science, industry, and willing workers could systematically overcome tyranny's forced brilliance extracted through coercion and suffering. And the Germans, standing in their observation posts along the coast watching their perfect weapons fall from the sky in flames, never understood why they had already lost a war that their leaders continued insisting they were somehow still winning despite all evidence to the contrary.